Hello, I want to welcome you to our webinar today, Introducing Transcelerate's Framework and Methodologies for Utilizing Modernized Analytical Software Tools. Next slide. We have a number of our team members from the Modernization of Statistical Analytics workstream with us today, who will present all that they've been involved in developing these solutions. They are also subject matter experts representing a variety of our member companies. My name is Shannon Keenan, and I'm the event moderator. I'd like to introduce you to Michael Rimler, Director of Clinical Programming and Innovation Lead at GlaxoSmithKline. Also, Lynn Taft, Statistics Leaders in Specialty and Global Health Therapeutic Area Biostatistics from GlaxoSmithKline. We have Peter Messingbrink, Executive Director of Biostatistics from Novartis. I want to welcome Suman Park, Senior Director of Clinical Research Systems, Processes, and Information at Eli Lilly and Company. And finally, Min Lee, Director of Biostatistical Programming at Amgen. Next slide, please. Today's agenda, I'm just going to do a couple minutes of housekeeping, and then I'll pass it over to Michael Rimler, who's going to take everyone through the Transcelerate and MOA Modernization of Statistical Analytics initiative and overview. He'll also lead you through the fundamentals of the MSA framework. Then Lynn Taft will take everyone through a use case of the MSA framework. We're fortunate to have senior leaders join us for a panel discussion led by Suman, Peter, and Min. And then we'll have a conclusion and call to action. Next slide, please. Just some basic logistics for today's webinar. All participants will be muted for this call in order to ensure a pleasant listening experience. You may reduce the GoToWebinar control panel by clicking on the orange and white arrow in the upper right corner. We welcome questions throughout the discussion. These questions can be submitted using the questions function you should see in your control panel. Be sure to select send after typing your question into the box. Next slide, please. Just a few ground rules. We want to make this discussion helpful and informative and answer as many of your questions as we can. We also want to let you know that participation is totally voluntary, and along with using any of the Transcelerate assets and tools. You do not have to identify what company you work for. There's a few things we ask you not to discuss. Please don't discuss what vendors, sites, CROs you are using or not using. Please do not discuss any issues you have with any vendors, sites, or CROs. Do not discuss your long-term development plans or anything related to costs. Neither myself nor the team can answer any questions about vendors, the cost of using or implementing Transcelerate assets or tools, or which member companies are using assets or tools. Next slide. In order to keep this session as interactive as possible, and also to facilitate sharing of useful and appropriate information, we're going to be using live polls throughout the session. Again, I just wanted to let you know your participation is completely voluntary. All responses will be anonymous. Answers will be shared only as a percentage of the respondents. And that will take us to our first poll today. Next slide, please. So our first poll is, what is your organization's top pain point with respect to the integrity of handling clinical data? Please select one: data quality, new methodologies, budget management, infrastructure, or timelines. You should be seeing the poll on your screen. Please select one. Great. It's interesting to see everybody responding. Thank you. We'll give it a couple, about 10 more seconds. Great. I'm going to close the poll, and I'm going to share out the responses. Interesting. You can see that we have 44% top pain point is data quality. Close in second, new methodologies and infrastructure, followed by timelines and budget management. Thank you for participating. Next slide, please. I'm now going to introduce Michael Rimler from GlaxoSmithKline, who's going to take us through the Transcelerate and MOA initiative overview.
Thanks, Shannon. Next slide. Before we dig into the framework, let me quickly talk a bit about Transcelerate. Transcelerate is a nonprofit organization created to foster collaboration and charged with improving the health of people around the world by accelerating and simplifying the research and development of innovative new therapies. Next slide. Transcelerate is a membership-driven organization and passionate about designing solutions to address R&D's most complex challenges related to clinical development and drug safety. It was founded in 2012, and since then over 60 solutions have been delivered across more than 25 initiatives, 3 strategic priorities, and 20 member companies. Next slide. So let's dig in. My role here today is to provide a high-level intro to the MSA framework, setting the stage for deeper discussions from the other presenters. Next slide. So what is the Modernization of Statistical Analytics initiative? It started from the recognition of a lack of evolution and regulatory perspective related to the analytical capabilities in the pharmaceutical industry. This presented an opportunity to provide clarity and instill confidence in the use of technologies when using modernized statistical analytical environments, opening the doors to more dynamic and efficient analyses, enabling delivery of innovative products to patients faster. And along the way, the project also provides guidance on expanding analytical options in the regulatory space and allows industry to evolve in its recruitment and retention of top talent. Next slide. Our objective was to develop a framework which instills confidence in the use of technologies for regulatory submissions. There are 2 main components to the framework. One focuses on the foundational principles of accuracy, reproducibility, and traceability, and the other focuses on best practices to support the framework's implementation. Next slide. The framework itself considers a number of characteristics of a particular technology when under evaluation, including things such as its source reputation, how long and how much it has been used by others, its development processes, the degree of testing, maintenance, and support, and other elements, which you see on this slide. Next slide. The journey started in January of 2020 with industry leaders who have diverse backgrounds in biostatistics, data science, pharma IT, regulatory, quality assurance, clinical programming, who came together to identify the building blocks to create the MSA framework, offering solutions using non-traditional software to overcome modernization challenges with the goal of improving speed of overall healthcare delivery. The team reviewed and evaluated the confidence in regard to non-traditional software to build the components of the MSA framework. The result is the framework that is available on the Transcelerate MOA website. And I know this is a busy slide, but we're going to try and keep things at a high level. Next slide. The framework for developing an MSA environment applies to both traditional and non-traditional software. It demonstrates that the MSA environment produces accurate and reproducible results with documentation that traces those results to their lineage of dependencies for each output. This end-to-end control is based on ART, which is accuracy, the correctness of the results, reproducibility, ensuring that the same input will result in the same output, and traceability, ensuring that you can trace inputs to the outputs. And we contend that demonstration of these elements will provide health authorities confidence in the reliability of efficacy and safety results of new drug candidates in regulatory submissions. It is important to note that while the foundational principles of the framework are specific and essential for the MSA environment, the particular implementation of them is entirely the purview of the respective organizations building it. Our paper and our presentation today are general proposals or best practices to help your organization implement a reliable MSA. Next slide. The implementation model is the second component. In the model, we see 4 phases. We have pre-planning, design, implementation, and production. Within each phase, there are stakeholders to manage and challenges to overcome. Core stakeholders include statisticians, analysts and programmers, data scientists, and standards groups. And in addition, for example, in the pre-planning phase, your program management may be among the key stakeholders. And in later phases, both tech and quality groups become key stakeholders. And although budgets and time are always challenges in any phase, as you can see in the lower left, the light blue box, different phases come with their own specific challenges. For example, in the design phase, that might be identifying your scope and key KPIs. And in the production phase, it might be change management and raising awareness to your users. Next slide. So in sum, the framework delivers deliverables aim to increase adoptions of modern computing environments. This slide is an overview of a proposed ideal state components of a modernized computing environment, such as accessibility, speed, reproducibility, and future-proofing. And since again, this is, my part here is really an intro presentation, I won't go through this slide in detail, but rather we can move on to our next poll, Shannon, and then on to Lynn Taft to review one of the MSA use cases.
Great, thank you, Michael. Yes, as we just heard a little bit about the MSA framework shared by Michael, we have another poll. If which phase below describes your company's current MSA implementation position, please select one. Is it pre-planning, design, implementation, production, don't know, or haven't started? Great. Again, purely voluntary. I see, good. We got a lot of good votes here. I'm gonna close the poll in like 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1. And then I'm gonna share out the results. Interesting. So we have a lot in the don't know, haven't started, 44%, 19% in the pre-planning, implementation and design phase, about 29%, and 8% in the production. Thank you so much for sharing that. Right, next slide, please. I want to introduce Lynn Taft from GSK, who's going to go through a use case review based off the MSA framework.
Thank you, Shannon. Hello, everyone. Next slide, please. Okay, so now I will walk you through a use case focusing on the testing and verification piece of the framework to achieve the 3 core principles of the MSA framework Michael just talked about: accuracy, reproducibility, and traceability, ART. You will hear me talking about R in this use case, but it is purely to illustrate how to apply the framework in a practical setting. And I want to specifically mention that Transcelerate do not endorse the use of any particular software. Next slide, please. Okay. Before going into details of the use case and the 3 principles of the MSA framework, I want to quickly summarize the scope of the framework. So the framework discusses the requirements, the programming infrastructure, and processes, which include risk assessment and medication practices to demonstrate reliability of an MSA environment. In the use case, we're going to talk about to establish an MSA environment, a multi-server computational environment was built, and the testing and verification were done based on the MSA framework. Next slide, please. Now let's think back to the 3 core principles of the framework: ART, accuracy, reproducibility, and traceability. You will hear me repeating these a lot because they're very, very important. Out of these principles, accuracy is probably the most challenging to implement, especially for the less traditional open source software. And just to remind everyone so we're on the same page, as Michael showed in an earlier slide, in the context of the MSA framework, accuracy is a measurement of the correctness of the software libraries that are used to generate results, not the programs the developers write using those software libraries. And as you can see in this confidence impact matrix, within an MSA environment, accuracy is not just a binary designation of yes or no, but it is rather an assessment based on two independent factors. If you look at vertically, it is judging the software's ability to demonstrate confidence in its results. It can be categorized to low, medium, or high, and horizontally, it is the intended use of its output. Also can be categorized as low, medium, or high. We'll talk about these two independent factors in more details in the next two slides, but for now, let's take a minute to look more at this matrix. Based on the different color coding in this matrix, different actions are being recommended. For example, in the blue tier, when the confidence is high, or when the confidence is medium but impact is low, it could be appropriate to use the software library for regulatory submission use without any testing or with only minimal additional testing beyond what has been provided. In the orange tier, when the confidence is medium and the impact is medium or high, or low confidence with low impact, it would require additional testing if used as part of a regulatory submission, but maybe no additional testing or maybe small amount of testing would be needed if the software library is just used for internal decision making. In the red tier, however, it is only appropriate without any additional testing for exploratory use. Any additional use, for example, for decision-making or regulatory submission, would require testing of different levels depending on its intended use. And in the use case I'm showing you, two different types of R installations were set up. One is for exploratory general use, and the other is for submission-related work. And generally, no additional testing was needed for the packages in the exploratory R installation, but in the installation for submission work, packages were assessed to identify what additional testings would be needed to provide enough confidence for submission-related work. This was done in a rather continuous way. Instead of marking a specific category of the confidence level, which was slightly different than was described in the framework, but you can always adapt the framework to the specific need of your organization. Next slide, please. Okay. Now we will split the confidence impact matrix into the confidence part and the impact part. We'll talk about assessing software library confidence on this page and the intended use and impact on the next page. As you can see here, when assessing any given software library for quality, we can classify a combination of attributes to denote a high, medium, or low level of confidence that the library can reliably deliver the functionality it proposes to do. For example, the high confidence means there is very little ambiguity that the software library produces accurate results from documented evidence of testing. This can be easily determined using documented or executable test cases, or dependency testing, or the use of a surrogate. And high confidence designates a software library as being suitable for use with the highest impact to the business outcome without any additional testing needed to mitigate risks. If the provided evidence of testing or its surrogates are not sufficient to provide high confidence, the software library may be designated as medium or low confidence. But you can always perform additional verification testing to increase its confidence level, as was done in the use case. So in the use case, it first assessed the packages by checking all the evidence of testing or any surrogates. Then any evidence the library is well maintained or being used successfully, etc., etc. But as I mentioned earlier, The specific use case didn't end up marking the high or medium or low confidence to each package, but rather it identified what needs to be done to increase the confidence to the highest level to support the submission. Next slide, please. In parallel of assessing the standalone quality of a software library, it is critical to understand the purpose the library will be used. So we may ask, what does it do, or how will it be used? And the specific categorization of software may be different depending on how your organization is implementing an MSA environment. This figure is trying to demonstrate in a general way how the software can be categorized. So for example, high impact directly affects patient safety or evidence supporting efficacy for regulatory submission. Medium impact can correspond to internal decision making, and low impact can be exploratory analyses and the ones that do not impact efficacy, safety, and internal decision making. As we talked about earlier, our installation in the use case generally doesn't require additional testing since it is only for exploratory and general work. But the frozen R installation for submission-related work would require the highest confidence possible, so the packages were mostly tested based on results of the confidence assessment. Next slide, please. In summary, in the use case, to ensure the accuracy, a frozen R installation was built for managing the system and software dependencies, where packages were assessed and further tested before putting in the curated software library. Next slide, please. Next, let's talk about the reproducibility. In the scope of the MSA framework, it is considered to be reproducible if a statistical analysis output can be recreated from the original data set along with the associated environment, including all the artifacts and dependencies. So if an output is not reproducible, we would be in big trouble because it would be questionable whether the results of the output can be trusted. So it is very essential that the environment is able to reproduce an output. And in the use case, a controlled execution is embedded in the frozen R installation and can fulfill the need of reproducibility. Next slide, please. Last but not least, in ART, it is the traceability. It refers to the ability to trace inputs to outputs, with the main goal being to provide evidence to connect e-data, programming code, and environment to the final output that is produced. There are a few elements that are especially critical. For example, data sets and programming used to produce the outputs, system libraries, programming engine, computing environment, etc., etc. And the use case is logging all these important elements in the controlled execution. Next slide, please. I hope it is really drilled to your head by now that the accuracy, reproducibility, and traceability are the core tenets of the framework that will deliver a reliable MSA environment. Accuracy will ensure the confidence, and the reproducibility and traceability are the key elements to enable trust. And as we demonstrated in the use case, they cannot be separated and must be integrated together cohesively. They're reflected as workflow in this slide. So the integration begins by identifying a program output's intended purpose, whether it's for submission or decision-making or exploratory or others. And processes needs to be established where programs executed within the MSA environment are appropriately tagged with intended use by the programmer or others. In the use case, we know the environment was just split into the usual R installation and frozen R installation for this purpose. And tools to scan programs or program logs need to be developed to identify libraries used and also assess the risk level to align with the allowable risk for the intended use. And then quality control processes to scan all the outputs from an MSA environment should be established to ensure the programs use appropriate software libraries. And besides logging, logs showing the software library components for a given program, those logs should also contain complete traceability from output back to things, for example, like source data sets or software libraries or version control and etc. etc. And given the environments will change over time with software libraries and or operating system version updates or dependent components can be located, given the environments will change over time, the dependent components can be located or localized so that the specific inputs to the program can be reused. Next slide, please. Okay. In summary, I just went through a use case we collected of the framework, where a multi-server computational environment was built that contains two installations for R, one for exploratory work and the other for submission. And based on the guidance of the MSA framework, a frozen installation to enable a controlled execution was built to support the submission work. And the packages used in this environment were put through the framework for verification and testing. And the stakeholders involved in this process are biostatisticians, statistical analysts, IT, and business representatives. And because of the multifunctional nature of this collaboration, it required lots of collaboration and early engagement from different stakeholders. One of the challenges related to this is not all the stakeholders are familiar with the environment. So the communication is so important. The business side and the IT side, they need to really understand each other and work very closely. And another challenge is that the constant development of the environment and the need of frequent updates and adding in new packages, which require a lot of resources for package validation. However, once the MSA environment is successfully implemented, it gives huge confidence in using packages for regulatory submission, and it enables traditional quality control process to be performed in the same system with the same toolkit. I believe this is my last slide, and there is a poll question on the next slide.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Lynn, and teed up perfectly for our third audience poll, which I'm going to launch. As what do you see as the most beneficial outcome resulting from applying the MSA framework? Please select one. It gives confidence in using a modern statistical analytic platform. It creates an opportunity to obtain health authority endorsement, or it improves recruitment and retention of talent. It's always so interesting seeing the numbers tick up. And just a reminder, thank you for everyone participating. It's purely voluntary. We'll give everybody a couple more seconds here to complete. We'll go down 3, 2, 1. I'm going to close the poll out. I'm going to share the results. Very interesting, pretty closely split between gives confidence in using a modern statistical analytics platform and gives the opportunity, it creates the opportunity to obtain health authority endorsement. Thank you so much, Lynn, for sharing out the use case of the MSA framework, and thank you for participating in that third poll. Next slide. Now we're going to get into the discussion panel portion of our webinar today. Next slide, please. We are so fortunate to be joined by 3 of the industry's experts. We have Peter Messenbrink from Novartis, Suman Park from Eli Lilly and Company, and Min Lee from Amgen. So just kind of thinking about what we heard today, we went through a little bit about the initiative, we went through the framework, and we actually got to see a real live use case, a practical implementation of the framework. Peter, I was hoping that maybe if you could say, you know, that kind of took us as where we are today. If you were to look out 18 months from now, what would a successful framework look like?